It was an ordinary day in an ordinary town when the alarms started to sound. Residents rushed out of their homes to see what was going on and saw fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars careening down the road faster than anyone had ever seen before. All of the chaos seemed to be centered around one location, the hospital. At first, people assumed that some sort of massive accident had occurred, a fire, a pileup on the highway, something that would require hundreds of people to need urgent medical treatment. But as curious eyewitnesses crowded around the hospital, they realized all of this commotion was not around people going into the hospital. There was something coming out. Hordes of people were running out of the hospital, some wearing hospital gowns, some dressed in their street clothes, some trailing IVs behind them that they didn't even seem to notice dangling from their hands. They were pale, sickly, twitching with strange jerky movements. Their eyes looked glassy and vacant, but they were staring right at the people outside the hospital. Something was wrong, horribly wrong, and the onlookers tried to run before the masses of people could get to them. But they were moving so much faster than people in their condition should have been able to. The bystanders couldn't get away in time, couldn't fight off the violent mob descending on them, flailing and shrieking and biting down on any exposed flesh they could see. The few people that were able to get away, the ones who made it to their cars and sped down the road away from the hospital, saw the chaos unfolding all across town. There were bodies lying in the streets, people running in packs like wild animals, tearing and gnashing their teeth, breaking through windows, and throwing themselves onto cars. Seemingly out of nowhere, everyone had just lost their minds. In all the pandemonium, no one thought to turn on the radio, to flip their television to the news. If they had, they would have seen that they were not the only ones whose town had gone crazy overnight. This was happening all over the world. In only a few months, 60% of humanity was either dead or turned into a monster. 20 years later, people walked down the same streets, now crumbling from neglect and an endless torrent of violence. Buildings were burned to the ground. Pillars of community turned to ash. Everyone who could wore a gas mask on their hip, just in case. Armed guards patrolled the streets, as the haunting sound of clicking and slow plodding footsteps could be heard just beyond the city gates. In such a short time, everything had fallen apart. How did this happen? What could have plunged the world into this kind of chaos and turned humanity against itself? It all began with a fungus, specifically a mutated strain of the South American cordyceps fungus, which first began infecting humans via contaminated crops. In The Last of Us, this mutated strain of cordyceps began to spread through the United States in September of 2013, flooding the hospitals with sick patients and causing massive food product recalls across the country. The Texas Herald reported on the recalls on September 26, 2013, stating, "The Food and Drug Administration's investigation of crops potentially tainted with mold continues across the country." Initial lists distributed to vendors nationwide warned against crops imported from South America, but now the scope is extended to include Central America and Mexico. Several companies have already voluntarily recalled their food products from the shelves. They didn't know it yet, but this mysterious illness was the cordyceps brain infection. The infection takes hold while the host is alive and can be spread through tainted food, airborne spores, or the bites of the infected. Once someone has been exposed and the cordyceps fungus has entered their body, several things begin to happen. Within 2 days of infection, the host loses higher brain function and becomes aggressive and irrational, losing touch with their humanity. After 2 weeks, the fungus begins to impact the visual cortex of the host, damaging their vision as the fungus growth spreads across their head and face. After a year, the host is rendered completely blind. If the host manages to survive for over a decade, they develop hard fungal plates over their body. When the fungus eventually kills its host, their body sprouts long stalks of fungus that release spores into the air, spreading the infection further. The fungus can only infect living creatures as it must feed on its host's tissue and cannot effectively feed on a corpse. That sounds terrifying to say the least, but thankfully cordyceps only exists in The Last of Us, right? Wrong. The game's developers were inspired by a parasitic fungus that is all too real. There are 400 different species of cordyceps fungus that behave in a parasitic way, infecting and taking over their hosts. Fortunately, the real cordyceps fungi tends to target a host that is quite a bit smaller than your average person: ants, wasps, spiders, and flies. But how does a fungus turn an insect or an arthropod into a zombie? It works like this. When ants forage for food, they can pick up fungal spores. When they pick up a spore belonging to one of these species of cordyceps, it infects the ant and begins to start growing fungal cells inside of the insect's body. At this point, the ant's behavior starts to change. It's subtle at first, a lack of interest in foraging for food or communicating with the other ants in its colony. Next, the changes become more noticeable. The ant is active at all hours of the day, even when its nest mates are sleeping or resting. Eventually, the ant will leave the colony behind altogether, venturing out into the forest to climb to a high point on a twig or a vine. Then, it'll bite down and remain there as the fungus consumes the insect's innards, killing the host. Then, it sprouts a stalk from the ant's corpse that it can use to spread more spores into the air. In 2017, Professor David Hughes, an entomologist at Penn State University, scanned thin slices of infected ants under a microscope and then used those images to build a 3D model of an infected ant. This allowed Professor Hughes and his team to see which parts of the ant were unchanged and which had been replaced with a fungus. There were many fungal cells in the ants' bodies, most located directly outside the brain without actually spreading inside of it. Rather than infesting the brain itself, the fungal cells formed a network with each other within the ant's body, communicating with each other and blocking the brain from interfering. The fungus took control of the ant's body while the brain was powerless to stop it. To quote Ed Young of The Atlantic, "The ant is a prisoner in its own body. Its brain is still in the driver's seat, but the fungus has the wheel." These zombie ants are not zombies the way we tend to think of them. They're very much alive, but still their behavior is being altered and the decisions they make are not their own. They're being puppeted by a parasite that tells their body what to do and where to go. At the moment of its death, an infected ant has no choice but to climb higher and higher until it's reached a good enough altitude for spreading as many spores as possible. Then it bites down to hold its body in place as the fungus breaks down the membrane covering its jaw muscle fibers, causing a contraction strong enough to damage or even destroy the muscle filaments. This ensures that the ant will not be going anywhere, even as its vital functions cease. Currently, there is no reason to believe that the cordyceps could infect human beings and manipulate them in the way it does ants and other insects. These fungi evolved to target specific hosts and only know how to deal with the insects they specialize in. They don't jump between different species of ants, so the leap from ant to human would be pretty much impossible. Still, that didn't stop The Last of Us creator Neil Druckmann from being inspired by a clip from the 2006 show Planet Earth, which featured a bullet ant infected with a species of cordyceps, climbing up a branch at the behest of the fungus. Once it reached the top of the branch, the ant died and sprouted a mushroom from its head. This image stuck with him, and he wondered what it might be like if a version of this same fungus was able to make the seemingly impossible jump to humanity. What would happen? The world of The Last of Us paints a grim picture. As the infection progresses, the mutated strain of cordyceps fungus begins to evolve and transform its host into an increasingly terrifying degree. There are 5 distinct stages of infection, each deadly in its own gruesome way. Once a person is bitten or infected via spores or contaminated food, they'll begin to show symptoms including coughing, muscle spasms, and behavioral changes as the invading organism slowly strips their humanity away. When the first stage of transformation is complete, they become a runner. As the name implies, runners are characterized by the ability to run and move unnaturally quickly, and they're largely reminiscent of the classic fast-moving zombies. Contrary to the more advanced stages of the infection, runners still look pretty much human. They travel in hordes and use their speed and numbers to attack any uninfected that they see. Next are the stalkers, who have been a host to the cordyceps infection for somewhere between 2 weeks and a year. As with the runners, their name serves to describe their primary hunting behavior. The infection has begun to take a toll on the integrity of their bodies, with decaying flesh and mushrooms sprouting out of their skin. So rather than use speed, they use stealth to attack their prey. They lurk in the shadows, waiting for an uninfected person to pass by, and when they least expect it, the stalker will pounce. Sometimes they attach themselves to a wall where the fungus can grow, the host sitting so still they might appear to be dead to a passerby. But when a potential victim gets too close, they'll break away from the wall and strike. When the host has been infected for at least 1 year, the cordyceps will have transformed them into a clicker. Clickers have fungus covering their entire bodies, including their faces. The fungal growth over their eyes has rendered them blind, forcing them to navigate the world via echolocation. This is the reason for the eerie clicking sound that they emit as they search for their prey. Their lack of sight has increased the sensitivity of their hearing, and they can pick up on the slightest sound in their vicinity. They may move slowly due to their advanced infection, but it's easy to hear them coming. But if they get close enough to reach you, their heightened strength makes them a formidable opponent. Infected that have progressed to the most advanced stage of the disease are bloaters. Bloaters have been infected for several years, and the fungus has ravaged their body to the point that they're no longer recognizable as the humans they once were. They've swollen to a massive size, their skin coated with fungal growths that serve as armor and weapons all at once. Bloaters are able to tear the growths off their bodies and throw them as spore bombs. They're also incredibly strong, capable of tearing their victims in half if they can get their hands on them. However, they move slowly and are more vulnerable to fire than other types of infected. A regional variation of the bloater is the shambler. Shamblers are infected that have reached the advanced stage of the bloater, but dwell primarily in an area with a great deal of water. They're not as strong as ordinary bloaters, but they are capable of expelling gaseous acidic spores from their body that burn the flesh of the uninfected. When a shambler dies, they release a dangerous cloud of cordyceps spores. The rarest form of infected, appearing only once on record, is the rat king. Like the legendary creature supposedly formed when the tails of many rats get tangled together and their bodies fuse into one monstrous rat, the rat king is made up of the bodies of numerous infected that combine into one organism over the course of 20 years. It's made up of clickers, runners, and stalkers all working together, and it is the most difficult type of infected to kill. No matter what form the cordyceps infection takes, no matter how far along an infected person is in their transformation, you definitely do not want to find yourself face to face with one. If you see someone behaving strangely, have the feeling something is watching you from the shadows, or hear that horrible clicking sound getting closer and closer, you better turn and run the other way. And don't stop until you're sure nothing is behind you.